Mr. Nelson has asked for an opportunity to voir dire the witness for a possible objection outside the hearing of the jury. Mr. Nelson.
Good afternoon, Sergeant Pfluger.
Good afternoon, sir.
So in the normal course of your duties as a police sergeant in reviewing the use of force, what you're describing is what you would normally do, correct?
Yes.
So if a use of force is reported to you by an officer, in those circumstances, this use of force review occurs by the shift supervisor, correct?
Yes.
And the shift supervisor would first and foremost report to the scene, correct?
Yes.
After that point, you would interview the officers that were involved, correct?
Yes.
You may interview the person upon whom force was used, right?
Yes.
You may interview witnesses to the use of force if they exist, correct?
Yes.
You may review body-worn cameras, other evidence, photographs, whatever else may be a part of that process, right?
Yes.
And it is much greater in it's a limited, but it's a bigger scope, right?
Yes.
When a use of force incident becomes a critical incident, however, does your role change?
I would no longer do a use of force in a critical incident,
Right.
nor would I do it if someone had suffered an injury, if they were handcuffed. That goes up the chain then to Lieutenant in Internal Affairs.
Okay. So in certain circumstances, you would not be required to do that, right?
Correct.
And also, in addition, Your Honor, or Sergeant Pfluger, I apologize, you did not do any of that use of force review on May 25th of 2020, did you?
No.
You didn't speak with the officers in depth about what happened, correct?
No.
You didn't interview any of the witnesses that were at the scene, did you?
No.
And you didn't review the body-worn cameras that night, did you?
No.
In preparation for your testimony, were you given the entirety of the case file for this case?
No.
I mean, do you have 50,000 pages of police reports?
No.
Have you reviewed any of the interviews from any of the witnesses?
No.
Have you reviewed any of the statements that were given relevant to this case by any of the involved officers from those who did give statements?
No.
All right. So in this case, in preparation, were you allowed to watch the entirety of all of the body-worn cameras?
I think I did.
Okay. And that was in preparation or while you were being interviewed with the state prosecutors, right?
Correct.
Okay. So in terms of the information you have a limited amount of information, which would be limited to just a review of the body-worn cameras.
Yes.
And that would not be the normal course for a sergeant's use of force review.
Yes.
I'm still not clear as to who made the decision in this case. So, Mr. Swisher, I don't have very much of a foundation for who gave this opinion or gave an opinion in this case. Could you follow up with?
I'm sorry, I had a hard time hearing.
I don't think I have a foundation yet. It sounds like on a critical incident, it gets passed up. Who made? I don't know who made the decision on use of force.
Well, there wasn't.
Could you maybe inquire, see where?
I can, Your Honor. I want to just clean up one part of the record first. In terms of reviewing the body-worn camera footage with the state, I think the question was state prosecutors. You didn't review them with the state prosecutors, but you have reviewed those with prosecutors. Is that correct?
Correct.
Right. Other prosecutors, not associated with this particular case.
Right.
Is that right?
Yes.
Now, to answer the court's question, in terms of whether or not you did a use of force review pursuant to the policy, in this particular case, you did not, correct?
Correct.
Right? You passed the scene along and followed the critical incident policy, per the critical incident guidelines. Is that right?
Yes.
However, in the course of your duties as a shift sergeant, you do force reviews. Is that right?
Yes.
You follow the policy in conducting supervisory force reviews.
Yes.
Right? And if we could pull up the exhibit again, 222. You could go to the next page, please. Okay. In conducting a force review, if you could please call out Roman I. You contact the internal affairs unit commander by phone if the force used appears to be unreasonable or constitute possible misconduct. Is that right?
Yes.
So you make a threshold assessment of whether or not force is excessive or could constitute possible misconduct. True?
True.
And if you could go to the next page. And call out B. And again, based on the totality of information available at the time, if you as a supervisor feel that the use of force may have been unreasonable or not within policy, you can state so in your supervisory force review. Is that right?
Yes.
And that's the policy that you follow.
Yes.
So, Your Honor, I don't believe that this is a lack of foundation. He has clearly an opinion, and a limited opinion, that based on his preliminary review, as stated and disclosed, he believed that the restraint should have ended very shortly after Mr. Floyd was taken to the ground, handcuffed, and no longer resistant. And that's the sum and substance of the opinion I intend to offer.
If I could just follow a couple questions. In this particular case, the reason you called the lieutenant was because Mr. Floyd died, right?
I would call the lieutenant first because force was used and he was in handcuffs. Any force that results or that's used when somebody's in handcuffs requires.
So that went up the chain naturally that way, and then when Mr. Floyd died, this use of force policy is replaced with, Your Honor, I guess the issue here is this is exactly what the motions in limine were designed to effectuate. This officer, Sergeant Pluger, did not make this determination. He has not done a use of force review as he would have done in this policy. He has not reviewed the entirety of the evidence in this particular case. And while he may have seen certain body camera footage and made some determination based on that limited information, he hasn't seen everything else. And so it is not within his purview. This is what the motion in limine was specifically designed.
Mr. Slisher, as I understood it, you're asking a narrower opinion?
That's correct, Your Honor. I'm asking, exactly what I proffered, that in his opinion, the force should have ended very shortly, handcuffed in the prone position and no longer resistant.
You can ask that one question. Let's bring the jury back.
We could get him done in a half hour.
Okay. We'll see how it goes. All right, previous questions withdrawn. Mr. Slisher, would you ask your question?
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, based on your review of the body-worn camera footage, do you have an opinion as to when the restraint of Mr. Floyd should have ended in this encounter?
Yes.
What is it?
When Mr. Floyd was no longer offering up any resistance to the officers they could have.
After he was handcuffed and on the ground and no longer resistant.
Correct.
Thank you. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Nelson.
Good afternoon, Sergeant Kluger.
Good afternoon, sir.
Thank you for being with us today. Few questions that I had to follow up on with you. When a police officer under your command uses force, are they required to immediately notify you?
It depends on the type of force.
Okay. Are there certain circumstances where you may get a phone call, or are there certain circumstances or situations where you may get a phone call or a report of a use of force within 10 to 15 minutes?
Yes.
Are there a use of force report or an hour or two later?
Not one that would cause me to have to go to the scene. That would be more immediate. They'd want to let me know right away because I need to get out there and interview the subject.
Right. But it could happen within more than, say, 10, 15, 20 minutes that you get that notification.
Yes.
It would be fair to say that in certain types of use of force, there may be other, or use of force cases, there may be other activities that the officer needs to do after the use of force. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So they may use force against suspect number 1, but then they have to apprehend suspect number 2, for example, right?
Yes.
And they've used force on number 1, but they get number 2 detained and it takes some time, then they call you, right?
Yes.
Or, for example, an officer may use force on someone, conduct some additional investigation, whether it be interviewing witnesses or gathering evidence, and then call you to report the use of force, right?
Yes.
Is there a policy within the Minneapolis Police Department that requires an officer who uses force to do that through dispatch channels?
No.
They could call you on your cell phone.
Yes.
They could send you a text.
Yes.
Basically, their requirement is that they need to reach out to you and say, hey, we need you to come to the scene, right? We
Yes.
use force. Now, just a second. Showing you Exhibit 221, Policy 5-306 regarding medical assistance. What do the first 4 words after medical assistance read?
As soon as reasonably.
Practical, right? Oh,
Yeah,
I
that's
said
5.
4. Ha, sorry, you got me. As soon as reasonably practical, right?
Correct.
An officer has to use or render medical assistance as soon as is reasonably practical, correct?
Yes.
Now, are you familiar generally with the Minneapolis Police Department's critical decision-making model?
Somewhat.
Essentially, when a police officer is engaged in a situation, would you agree that an officer is constantly taking in new information, processing that information, comparing it to what happened before, and making decisions based on information as it comes in?
Yes.
And information as an officer is dealing with the situation can change, right?
Yes.
And that information that they take in may change or modify the behavior in response to the situation, right?
Yes.
So for example, sometimes an officer may decide to use a taser or a conducted electricity unit, right? But then realize, that's not enough, I better get my gun out, based on the threat that they perceive, right?
Yes.
Or vice versa, they may have their gun drawn, realize that's too much force, put it away, and take out a different tool that they have, right?
Yes.
So officers are constantly assessing and reassessing a situation based upon the information as it comes to them. Agreed?
Yes.
You were an officer for what, 27 years, I think you said. You've, I'm assuming arrested hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals during your career.
Yes.
You've had to use force yourself.
Yes.
And would you agree with the general premise that the use of force is not necessarily attractive?
Yes.
Sometimes officers have to do very violent things. Agreed?
Yes.
It's a dangerous job.
Correct.
Have you ever heard the term hold for EMS? An officer says, I held him for EMS.
I'm not familiar with that.
Okay. So if you are involved in a use of force situation and an officer calls for medic,
Rephrase.
I'll rephrase, thank you. Assume an officer was engaged in a struggle with a suspect and decided to use the maximal restraint technique, but then the suspect had a medical emergency. Would it be common for the officer to decide, I'm not going to use the maximal restraint technique at this point. I'm going to hold this suspect in place until EMS gets here?
Objection calls for speculation.
Overruled.
So your scenario is an officer's planning to use the hobble and hasn't put it on yet, and then the suspect has a medical emergency, and then they decide not to use it, just hold them?
Right.
Yes.
When a maximal restraint technique is applied, the suspect is essentially handcuffed behind their back, and through a series of belts, their legs are bent, and EMS has to come. The officers have to remove that potentially, right?
Correct.
And that can delay medical treatment.
Sure.
Now again, in your 27 years as a police officer, have you had to deal with crowds of people that form and watch your activity?
Yes.
In your experience as a police officer, especially in the more recent era, in a situation where bystanders begin to film you and your activities,
Yes.
does that than it did 5 years ago?
Yes.
And have you been in a situation in your career as a law enforcement officer where the crowd starts to yell at you
Yes.
or becomes a little more volatile
Yes.
as an officer?
Yes.
Generally speaking, as again, an officer with 27 years of experience, if you're dealing with one potential suspect and then a new perceived threat emerges, but you know that person needs medical attention, do you deal with the medical attention and ignore the threat, or do you deal with the threat and then deal with the medical attention?
I guess you'd have to deal with both kind of simultaneously.
And that depends on the circumstances. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So for example, if you were in a gun battle and someone was shooting at you and someone went into cardiac arrest, would you stop what you were doing to mitigate the threat, or in order to immediately perform CPR?
I'd
Or would you
mitigate,
continue with the threat?
I'd mitigate that threat to me.
You being of the Minneapolis Police Department,
Yes.
you had to deal with suspects who've been rendered You're aware that the Minneapolis Police Department, where the training indicates that you need to be careful because when someone comes back out of unconsciousness, they can become more volatile than they were before?
That can happen, yes.
You were asked a series of questions about about the sergeant's use of force review, right? A force review.
Yes.
And in a force review, there are certain things that you're required to do, correct?
Yes.
That would include having a conversation with the involved officer, right?
Right.
That would involve potentially having a conversation with the suspect upon whom force was used, agreed?
Yes.
Review of the body-worn cameras, right?
Yes.
Review of any other evidence that may exist, such as witness statements, photographs, phone records, whatever it may consist of, right?
Yes.
It's not a huge, very thorough investigation. It's kind of a cursory look. But there's more to it than simply